Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is another Iran conflict analysis, stream of consciousness, update, look at what is going on, what we know, what we don't know. And I also want to admit to you that I'm having a slight change in my evaluation of whether it was a good thing to do. Not because of new data, not because it is clear that there is mission creep or potential for mission creep from Trump, not because Trump's rationale for doing it was actually possibly very, very different from anyone else's. And we'll talk about this. There's some interesting data coming out. But because I've just cogitated a bit and changed the weighting of some of my inputs into my function machine of rationality, and my output that was about 55%, I kept mentioning about 55% in favor of these strikes from a very narrow point of view. So just to remind you, narrow strikes on nuclear facilities, that's it. Get in, bomb, get out, because the US is the only nation that has these bunker buster bombs that could do the trick, assuming that they can actually do the trick, and we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. But that would be it. In, out, no further involvement, no need for the UK, for any other nation to get involved. Just the Americans go in, strike the nuclear facilities, because the main thing I care about is that a theocratic dictatorship doesn't get its hands on nuclear capabilities, given that it's enriching uranium. It doesn't matter whether it's going to be 2 weeks, 2 months, or 2 years. That needs to stop, nip it in the bud, so on and so forth. But I also said it should have involved congressional approval, because I think that was important from an American domestic point of view, and it didn't. So I'm not a fan of how that worked out. But what I was essentially saying is that the international legality, if you look at international law, it is somewhat murky. Some people have questioned me that it's not murky. It's very clear. Actually, most conclusions appear to say that it is inconclusive. There are scholars that sit on both sides of this, which means it's not clear cut. And in fact, Article 51, around which this legal argument is concerned, Article 51 doesn't say an awful lot about preemptive strikes. So you've got to do an awful lot of filling in the gaps, and that leads to subjective interpretations. And there is no surprise that people sit on different sides of this, but you would need to challenge it in court, and there could be a call for, or there should be a call for this to be challenged, I guess. Even if I agree with it, let's see if it is legally defensible. But my kind of position was, even if it isn't like very clear cut, it's still the right thing to do. So there's a difference between morality and legality. It was the right thing to do because we really need to stop Iran getting their hands on this. This eventually, this leads to it's an evil for a greater good. Consequentialist ethics here, that we might have fudged the law a little bit here, but even that's not definite. But you can excuse fudging the law here because the goal, the outcome, is so freaking valuable that it is more valuable than fudging a law. Now, where my weighting is changing in my evaluation is that fudging the law, if that's what has happened here, might lead to some serious consequences. Now, I knew this at the time, but I've just cogitated it. I've sat down and thought about this, and I've just convinced myself, with the help of others, that actually, well, I'm not trying to convince myself. It's just like there's no agency. I'm not trying to come to a conclusion that actually these strikes were less justifiable. It just so happens that my valuation has changed. So let's give you some other people talking about this before I'm going to give you an analogy that I think perfectly encapsulates what's going on here, to do with films.
What does Trump do?
So this is Rory Stewart on the right here, and Alistair Campbell on the left. Rory Stewart is a moderate conservative. Alistair Campbell is left-winger from the UK, both of these guys. And they have come to the conclusion now that this is not defensible. The strikes are not. So let's just see in this particular area of international law what they have to say.
And this is the key, and this is where the limits and end state come in. If Iran, as is likely, signals defiance, mounts counterattacks, says it's going to find some way of secretly pursuing its program, what does Trump then do? And almost certainly he will then feel insulted and feel he has to do more, at which point Iran does more, at which point he does more. And that's why the question of what this whole thing is about and where does it end? Is he trying to change a regime? That's clearly what many people in Israel want. Or is he just trying to hit the nuclear program and then he doesn't mind what they do? Doesn't mind how they respond? Doesn't mind who they attack? And so, sorry, back to you on that. Yeah.
No, you're going to say just you made the point about the regime and the opposition. The opposition apparently are having some big press conference in Paris today or tomorrow and obviously they do want to sort of push for regime change. But what the MAGA people are clearly saying right from the word go, this is not about regime change. And interestingly, even though Netanyahu hints at it all the time, he's perhaps been reined in a little bit by Trump on that.
These guys recorded this before Trump has basically hinted at regime change, and I did my news piece on that this morning. So go and check that out, because there looks to be mission creep, which is one of my problems, but it doesn't affect my evaluation whether it's a good thing or not, because my evaluation is not Trump's evaluation, right? And Trump is doing other things, and that is bad, because that's I've got my strict, narrow set of principles.
And it's interesting to see the international reaction. Pretty muted, but Guterres, the head of the UN, gravely alarmed, dangerous escalation, direct threat to peace and security, growing risk the conflict could get out of control with catastrophic consequences for civilians, the region and the world. And then, Keir Starmer has based fairly sort of low key. The US has taken action to alleviate the threat. Iran's nuclear program is a grave threat, can't be allowed to develop nuclear weapons. The situation in the Middle East remains volatile, stability in the region priority, call on Iran to return to the negotiating table. The problem with all of this, though, and this is, maybe this is the strategy. When I say Trump doesn't have a strategy, maybe I'm being unfair to this extent. He has an objective, which is to make his own power virtually insurmountable. And part of that strategy has been the deliberate undermining of the international institutions. And Jim Himes, the congressman who we talked to a while back, he's straight out saying that this is an unconstitutional act. Congress has to declare war, not the president. So but I'd say the international reaction so far fairly muted.
Yeah, well, and very disturbing, that, isn't it? Because this is a complete departure from the way in which we tried to keep peace in the world since 1945. So after the Second World War, the conclusion was that the way to stop new Hitlers, new Japans rising was to have a United Nations, to have international laws, to have legislative approval, to put all the barriers you could in the way of people just saying, might is right. I've got some big bombs and I can drop them on whoever I want, whenever I want, right? We've lost that totally. We're getting into a very, very muddled world in which we're making arguments which nobody would have made in the 50s, 60s, or even in much more recently. I mean, it's shocking, actually, that Keir Starmer, who is a lawyer and who cares about international law and whose attorney general was signaling that he was pretty concerned about Trump moving planes to Diego Garcia, because the UK attorney general, before the strikes, said that it was very questionable whether there would be the legal right to do this strike. After the event, they all come in behind him. And that was true of France. That was true of Germany last week. So now, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is we now move to a world which feels much more like the world before the First World War, where basically might is right. if you can strike someone, you will strike someone. And what does that mean? Well, that means that everybody else around the world, if you're China, Russia, North Korea, you draw the lessons from this. You begin to...
Well, just on that, let's just take this question from Cole S. How much does this increase the incentive for China to take Taiwan? The US has got tied up resources in 2 wars. There's less global moral high ground for the West in time of offensive war. And of course, add to that, you and I both said recently that although we don't think that Trump is necessarily serious about his threats to turn Canada into 51st state, that he is serious about Greenland. Now, if European leaders now are, and fair play, Macron went to Greenland, and I think that's what pissed Trump off to leave the G7 early, but unless European leaders are staking out these positions on principle, but the politics for this, for people like all leaders around the world, the politics of this now are an absolute nightmare. He's made it so much worse for all of them by cutting them out of the discussions and the decision making.
But none of them are none of them are standing up. None of them are standing up. I mean, what's so bizarre?
Well, Guterres is.
Yeah, Guterres is. Yeah, but what about the Europeans? I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, traditionally, the reason why the US built coalitions and alliances was to have international support. Trump has now accurately concluded that he's in a world where the European leaders are such wimps that he can do whatever the hell he wants, whenever he does it, and none of them will criticize him. In fact, they'll all come in behind him and say it was terrific, even if 2 minutes before he did it, they were saying publicly that it would be a bad idea to do. I mean, there's no consistency. How can Britain go from saying with the Attorney General just a few hours ago, this is a potentially illegal action, to then coming immediately out and saying, well done, great, well done you, Mr. Trump?
I don't think he's quite saying, he's not quite saying well done, great. He's saying he's giving the explanation. He's essentially framing the Trump explanation for why he's done it, and then sort of calling for de-escalation, because they've been calling for de-escalation since Israel went in the first place. There's a question here, Ruth Fitzgerald, Rory. How will Putin react? Will he take any action? Can he? Putin he'll be sort of feeling he's further justified in what he's doing.
Well, so this is now will define the future. Will be called the Fordow case. Every time somebody does something around the world, Russia, China, the US, goodness knows who else, they will say, well, it's like Fordow. We're doing preemptive. Oh, yeah, okay, it's 12 months off, but we're preempting. Let me just, the 2 things which I was really struck by. I've just been thinking about Eisenhower and Suez and how different the world was. And there were 2 points that Eisenhower makes, which I think are really interesting, which show how much the world's changing and how bizarre this new world is and how dangerous it is. Eisenhower basically says 2 things. Number 1, you cannot do things preemptively. Your excuse can't be, they're about to get me. And secondly, he's saying you can't have one rule for your allies and one rule for your enemies, right? So here are his quotes. So this is on preemption. He says this about Suez. Britain, France, and Israel had come to believe, probably correctly, that Nasser was their worst enemy in the Middle East, and that until he was removed or defeated, there would be no peace. I do not quarrel with the idea that there is justification for such fears, but I have insisted long and earnestly that you cannot resort to force in international relationships because of your fear of what might happen in the future. So that's the preemption bit. And then one more short one. We cannot, and this is about allies,
and that's very interesting, and I think that's open to debate. But the problem is, what constitutes justified preemption? And there's a very subjective understanding here, and there's clearly going to be no clarity. I mean, the problem with law just in general is that you try and make these sweeping laws to fit all scenarios, but then you can always find a situation where you kind of, we can explain why this person did that because of this and that, and then actually it's kind of more justified. So, but then you adapt the law, and then you have paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3, subsection, and the law becomes so granular eventually because you have to have tinkering for each individual case almost, and that's very difficult. So when you've just got Article 51 as defining how we should act, and Article 51 is not very useful, Article 51 UN, then it is no wonder that there is a lot of grey area here. And I know some people say, no, there is international legal clarity, but I really don't think there is. And that's, if you just go and even simply Google this, you'll find that the returns you're given suggest that there isn't legal clarity. So nothing in the present charter shall impair the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations until the Security Council has taken measures necessary to obtain international peace and security. Measures taken by members in the exercise of the right to self-defense shall be immediately reported to the Security Council and shall not in any way affect the authority and responsibility of the Security Council under the present charter to take at any time such action as it deems necessary in order to maintain or restore international peace and security. So it's like members in the exercise of this right of self-defense. So you've got this right of self-defense, but how much does preemption fit into that? And this is why there's been, that you can go and look at lots of different journal entries on this. So again, I will contest how that there is legal clarity on this, because if there was, there wouldn't be all these journal entries on exactly, was Bush doctrine justifiable, and is there enough clarity here? And there just isn't. I'm just absolutely positive that there isn't. But just to finish off this set of thoughts from these guys.
Cannot in the world any more than our own nation subscribe to one law for the weak, another for the strong, one law for those opposing us, another for those allied with us. So Eisenhower would be saying, look, listen, I get it. Israel is our close ally. Even the US is our close ally. And Iran isn't. But you can't have one law for Israel and the US and another law for Iran. Otherwise, it's not the law.
Yeah, well, that debate is, I think, one of the reasons why the international response is feeling quite fragmented. It's feeling quite weak, and I think at some point these leaders have to make a stand about the importance of American alliances. And when we announced that we were doing this emergency podcast, there were people, as ever, on Twitter in particular, saying, "Who the hell wants to hear from you? You started a war in Iraq, da 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 da," unusual stuff. But as we were saying the other day, this feels so different. I can remember a weekend. I think it was a weekend when Tony Blair made, I can't even remember how many phone calls to the presidents of, I think it was Chile and Mexico, because they happened to be two of the sort of swing states on the rotating United Nations Security Council. And he was absolutely determined to, and at one point we're talking literally about doing a day trip to, I think it was Mexico, to go and see Vicente Fox. And in the end, we didn't. But it was because he was working flat out with George Bush and others to try to take the thing down the United Nations route. You mentioned Richard Herman, the Attorney General. The various inquiries that we've had into the Iraq war. I mean, how much scrutiny was there on the discussions that we were having, Tony Blair was having with the Attorney General? And it feels in this one as though all of that has just been pushed to one side. Yeah. It's a whim. And when the Vice President says, we just trust his instincts, then where is international law? Where are the alliances? Where are the risks? What assessment was actually being done?
Yeah, this is Cold Harbour's question. There's been no mention of US legal basis for getting involved. Will there be repercussions from the UN? What is the UN's role in this now? Well, I would argue we're now in a world in which the UN is entirely irrelevant.
And that's really the key here. So I think the UN was already so fundamentally sort of flawed and impotent in many people's eyes over Russia and Ukraine. I just don't think it's been able to do an awful lot, and I think now you're going to see it even less so, and that is a problem going forward. It needs to be reformed. The Security Council needs a long, hard look at, and that needs to be reformed, and Russia sitting there permanently. But the whole notion of that idea, but the idea for all of these nations, that the privileged positions and whatnot, it feels that now more than ever it is impotent, and something needs to be done about it. And actually, allowing the US to not go down the legal route. That's not to say that their strike isn't in any way legal, right? But it's not being challenged. There's no, like, the idea that Alistair Campbell had here is that there seems to be no assessment of the legality. The difference, you can say this is Iraq 2.0, right? And Alistair Campbell gets in a lot of trouble for this because that was seen as Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell taking the UK into being in lockstep with the US and weapons of mass destruction, and then it was etc etc. But actually they worked really hard to make sure that there was kind of UN consensus over this, and etc etc. There appears to be none of that, and we're going to talk about that in a second, because it turns out that there's more and more data to suggest that Trump decided to do this because of vibes. Like, that's the extent of his analysis here, and then the rest is going to be post hoc rationalization. So this is a period where the UN is effectively completely meaningless.
I think what the US has just done a few hours ago is the end of the United Nations as we know it. Now, as you've pointed out, it's been getting weaker for a long time. But this is actually the end. Guterres now sounds like a lone voice in the wilderness. He sounds like he's speaking 10 years ago. We're now in a world in which Russia claimed preemption to go into Ukraine. That was their reason. They said, we're going in because Ukraine poses an existential threat to Russia, so we've got to invade. Now America has said, Iran poses an existential threat to the US, so we've got to go and hit them. When those two big members of the Security Council do that, and when Britain and France, the other two members of the Security Council, back them in doing this, or in this case, back the US in doing it, we're now in a world in which there isn't any international law. And as you say, the smaller countries, medium-sized countries, don't matter. Nobody's consulting them. So what does this then mean? Well, look, let's play through one scenario that's not implausible. Let's say that there is a dispute about an island in the South China Sea. So there's an argument at the moment, real argument going on between China, Vietnam, Philippines, Japan about some of these islands. Let's say Vietnam or the Philippines suddenly decides to seize one of these islands. What does the international community do? They can't apply to international law. Presumably, Philippines, Vietnam just say, well, this is an existential threat. We need to get the island. And then what happens when China drops a big bomb on that island and blows it up? What can the world say? I mean, if we have literally got ourselves into a world in which we just say the instinct of the leader and the most powerful country can just do whatever they want, whenever they want, we have gone a very, very long way back in time. We haven't just gone back before the First World War. We've almost gone back before, the Treaty of Westphalia. I mean, we're going back into a world where there isn't any international law at all.
And I'll leave that there. I mean, absolutely fascinating discussion. Sorry to spend so long in playing that out, and thank you very much to those two. Go and subscribe to their channel. Rest of Politics is absolutely brilliant. But this made me think a lot, and it's not that I didn't know. Of course, I recognise this, but I just applied a much lower weighting to this argument, and I'll explain how I did that. The analogy is a film, so it's about micro versus macro appreciation of what's going on. I was looking at the strikes on Iran in a very micro sort of level. Even if it requires fudging the law here, it's for the greater good here, and that is a good thing, and I still completely agree with that. So from a micro level, if no one else was looking at this, I think the strikes on Iran were justified, and I still believe that. But the problem is, when you take it out to the macro level, that is no longer justifiable. The analogy is to do with movies and films. We have, and that's probably why I was thinking the way I was thinking. We have been born and brought up, many of us, on a diet of films, Hollywood films, films left, right, and centre. And so many of them do this, whether it's a series 24 or whether it's James Bond or whether it's any action film, some kind of Jason Statham action, Liam Neeson, whatever it is, right? These schlocks, standard, but even not schlock, like all levels of film have this idea, so many of them at the heart of them, and police dramas as well, that oh, in order to get this done, we're gonna have to bend the laws. But actually, if we don't bend the laws, then we're not going to get this thing achieved, and that the laws are kind of holding us back, even though we are being good in what we're doing to achieve this greater goal, this greater good up here. Let's just smash the, and they delve into this kind of thinking an awful lot in 24. I remember with Kiefer Sutherland, and the idea that, well, is it right to torture, and is it right to do this? Well, if we get the blah blah blah, and they're always playing around with consequentialist ethics in 24. I remember thinking at the time when I was, with my philosophical hat on, just watching these series and films, just thinking, yeah, that's what they're doing now. Okay. And you go along with that. Like, we all go along with those ideas, broadly speaking. I know that you can have some debate and it makes you think, but generally we'll watch a film where like some kind of vigilante or do-gooder like bends the law, or policeman bends the law just a little bit here. I need to bend the law here so that I can achieve this greater good. And we sink it. And actually we use that rationale, or we tend to agree with that rationale so much. Honestly, go and watch any movie, action, drama, anything like that. You will have this consequentialist trolley experiment, thought experiment going on. It's just so unbelievably common. And when you're watching a film, so when you've got Kiefer Sutherland going and, I don't know, jumping through a burning building and, I don't know, breaking the rules here to then be the winner at the end, you're like, that's brilliant. Yeah, so that worked. Yep, it was the right decision. I knew it was. It's not like everyone else in the world is watching Kiefer Sutherland and their behaviours are being informed by what Kiefer Sutherland does or James Bond does, as James Bond does something morally dubious there to achieve his greater goal over here. It's not like that's on camera for everyone watching to go, oh, now he's done that, I'm going to do that. Now he's used that rationale, I'm going to use that rationale over here. And actually this is informing global kind of behaviors. No, these are just single incidents on a micro level that you look at and you go, yeah, I would do that. I know it's dubious, but it's that greater goal I've got in mind. And you don't think about repercussions. It's like, yeah, that happened. And then that did happen in this film, and there's a happy ending. Good, right? I agree with that. Great, I'm going to go to bed now. That's how I was inclined, I think, to look at the strikes on Iran. And the reality, I think, is that this is not some kind of, hour-long episode of a show, and there are no implications to this other than we've kind of understood what's going on, and then, yeah, that's done, right, see you later. That actually, the actions of the US, particularly the US, will inform global politics going forward, and in this case, effectively renders the UN completely impotent. Now, it's been and done now, and what is the reaction going to be? This is a continuation of what is probably an existent slippery slope here, where the UN is rendered more and more irrelevant, and that's what Rory Stewart was saying there. And it's just, I think this is a problem because now you have legal, if you like, precedent or illegal precedent, and what the US hasn't done, or what Trump hasn't done, is bothered to at least even try and present a legal case, because there might well be some legal justification for this, right? So it's not, like I keep saying, it's not immediately clear that this is breaking law because the law is so freaking vague. But at least, do your damnedest to put together a really cogent case, a legal sounding case. But they haven't done that. So, okay, let's then take... So, essentially what I'm saying is that my evaluation has now gone from 55% in support of this probably to about 47% in support. So I'm now back into, I broadly don't support this, but I still do support the strike in the macro level. Like, if no one else is watching this, like, I completely agree with striking those nuclear facilities. Like, there's no great loss of life. considering the gain you get. And the gain is, I find it really important that it's really important for me that a theocratic dictatorship does not get its hands on these really destructive weapons and capabilities. So what this comes down to is when you're watching 24 or the police drama or some action film, and it comes down to, oh, shall I just bend the laws a little bit here to do this greater good? Essentially, the answer is no, you shouldn't. Because if you do that, then the rule of law breaks down. And if the rule of law breaks down, anyone can do this. But of course, when you're watching a film, it doesn't have that effect because no one else is watching. That's just the decision of this one guy in his one particular circumstance. Like, shall I punch this guy in the face to get the right answer out of him so I can go and do something good over here, like in a warehouse or whatever? And you're like, oh, okay, well, I don't like the fact you did that, but you've got, yeah, okay, brilliant. And it's just, it's in its own bubble and it has no knock-on effects. But for the US to do that in public, particularly massively in public, it does have an effect. And that effect is to pretty much say to Russia that they can make whatever preemptive strikes they want if they can claim that there's an existential threat. And China, etc., etc. And then you get questions about, well, is the existential threat, was there genuinely an imminent threat to the US? And there wasn't, as according to so many sources, and that appears to be the case now. I think that's more problematic because I've talked about this many times, that the imminence of that threat, I think, it is an existential threat, but it could be 2 years away. And it's still an existential threat. So I think the imminence question is, for me at least, it's less relevant. I really don't think it's relevant. For many, you might say, well, actually, if it's not imminent, then it gives diplomacy a chance to do its thing. And this is where we get back to the issue that Donald Trump is the arsonist with a fire hose. So he's putting out the fire that he started, and we get back to the JCPOA being ripped up by Donald Trump. And yeah, that is definitely an issue. You look here. It's another one of these infographics. As Gary Winslet says, it cannot be emphasized enough that JCPOA had Iran's nuclear program contained and did so without a war. We had this under control and Trump blew it up. So Trump did blow it up. Trump did rip that up. And that is why we're here today, largely. And then Trump goes and solves it by bombing. That bombing thing in isolation, that's where I'm in the micro. Yeah, right now, given that that's happened, that has happened. So we can't go back in time and stop Trump from doing that. But right now, they are above where they're at that previous time in terms of nuclear activity and enrichment. And I think it's just about justifiable to make those strikes. But now I'm saying, given my evaluation of the knock-on effects, I'm rejigging my calculation. So Trump has then, because this is then having a negative effect on the price of oil, he's now coming out saying, everyone keep oil prices down. I'm watching, you're playing right into the hands of the enemy. Don't do it. What? No, that's what you've done by bombing Iran. It's just insane, his reasoning here. To the Department of Energy, drill, baby, drill. And I mean now. So he's desperate to get the price of oil has spiked, obviously, because the Strait of Hormuz, it might be shut. And, Iran just in general, as a producer of oil, is these attacks on Iran are not going to be beneficial for the price of oil. Right, so let's go and then look at whether it has done any damage, these strikes, or the requisite damage. John Ridge says, I'm loath to admit it, but Jeff Lewis here, Dr. Jeffrey Lewis, is right on a few points. The new UGF at Natanz must be attacked, and the UGF at Isfahan must be re-attacked. Our effort is wasted if we do not completely destroy Iran's capacity to manufacture and operate centrifuges. So John Ridge, who I generally agree with, but he's obviously coming from a military point of view, he's saying, actually, we need to re-attack these because you haven't done enough. The damage has not been enough. So Jeffrey Lewis here says, why am I so unimpressed by these strikes? Israel and the US have failed to target significant elements of Iran's nuclear materials and production infrastructure. Rising Lion and Midnight Hammer, so the two operations, are tactically brilliant, but may turn out to be strategic failures. Netanyahu's justification for conducting this strike was that Iran has produced enough highly enriched uranium for 9 atom bombs. 9. He refers to Iran's stockpile of around 400 kilograms of 60% U-235, so enriched uranium. If further enriched, could be enough for 9 to 10 weapons. Let's consider. The 400 kilograms of HEU was largely stored in underground tunnels near the Isfahan uranium conversion facility. Despite extensive Israeli and US attacks on the facility, there does not seem to have been any effort to destroy these tunnels or the material that was in them. No one even knows where the HEU is now. Even Rafael Grossi says Iran moved it. Marco Rubio says nothing can move in Iran, but trucks are moving in Iran. Trucks and heavy equipment showed up on at least 2 days ago to seal the tunnels to protect them. And Planet satellite imageries took images of that. Trucks also showed up at a Fordo FEP the day before the strike, possibly to relocate sensitive equipment and certainly to cover those entrances with dirt. Iran just isn't a no-drive zone at the moment. To be fair, some Trumpkins acknowledge Iran still has the material. JD Vance says they're going to, quote, have conversations with the Iranians about it. The talking point is that the US has knocked out Iran's ability to further enrich it and convert it to metals, so it's fine. In 2022, Iran moved a centrifuge production line to the heart of the mountain there. This facility is huge. We estimated 10,000 square meters or more, and we don't really know what else it might house, like enrichment or conversion. Also, Iran recently announced a new enrichment facility in a secure location and told the IAEA it was ready to start installing centrifuges. The IAEA was set to inspect the facility near Isfahan before the bombing. It hasn't been bombed as far as I know. So let me say again, Iran said it had a new enrichment facility. The IAEA was about to go see it, but before it could happen, Israel struck other facilities in Iran, but not the new one. See the problem? This means Iran has retained 400 kilograms of 60% HEU, the ability to manufacture centrifuges, and 1, possibly 2 underground enrichment sites. That is also to say nothing of possible secret sites which opponents of the JCPOA use to invoke it all the freaking time. Let's say Iran decides to rush a bomb. Iran can install 1.5 cascades a week in 6 weeks. It could have 9 cascades of IR-6 machines. It would take those machines about 60 days to enrich all 400 kilograms to weapons-grade uranium. Altogether, that's about 5 months, although IMMV, so it might, give or take. Look, I get it. Watching bombers conduct an 11,000-kilometer precision bombing raid is awesome. I am the sort of weirdo who happily read a 528-page book about the Black Buck raid of the Falklands War in 1982. I really do get it. But what does it say of 2 of the most amazing military operations in modern memory are still unable to fully eliminate Iran's nuclear program? I think that's proof that the tactical brilliance may be in service of a foolhardy strategy. Rising Lion and Midnight Hammer have not slowed the Iranian program nearly as much as the JCPOA. We hold diplomacy to much higher standards than bombing. The same people who endlessly complained about the JCPOA sunsetting are now happy to delay Iran's bomb by much less. This is why I said the strike is about regime change. As late as May, Defense Intel said Iran had not restarted its nuclear weapons program. When asked about that, Marco Rubio said Intel was irrelevant. It's only relevant if the problem is the regime and not the program. We ought to judge this strike by its real purpose, not the lethal camouflage or legal camouflage of preemptive self-defense. If the strike leaves a current regime or something very much like it in power with nuclear option, then it will have been a strategic failure. Okay, so that's his analysis. And of course, there's still lots of unknowns here. We don't know the battle damage assessment for sure. But the Wall Street Journal has reported that Vance signals Iran still controls enriched uranium stockpile, which is a bit of a problem. We are going to work in the coming weeks to ensure that we do something with that fuel, and that's one of the things that we're going to have conversations with the Iranians about. So it looks like there's an understanding that they didn't completely obliterate, as Trump said, the capabilities. It would seem Vance is telling the truth because apparently no GBU-57s were dropped on the facility Iran uses to store its uranium-235, says George Conway. And then Anton Gerashchenko then gives us a breakdown of what Grossi says, Rafael Grossi from the International Atomic Energy Agency. who has just been speaking. He has described the condition of the Iranian nuclear sites targeted by the US strike. So at Fordo, craters are visible at the Fordo site, Iran's main location for enriching uranium to 60%, indicating the use by the USA of ground-penetrating munitions. At this time, no one, including the IAEA, is in a position to assess the underground damage at Fordo. Isfahan, at the nuclear site there, additional buildings were hit overnight, and the US confirming their use of cruise missiles. Affected buildings include some related to uranium conversion process. Also at this site, entrances to tunnels used for the storage of enriched material appear to have been hit. At Natanz, enrichment site, a fuel enrichment plant has been hit again, with the US confirming that it used ground-penetrating munitions. There'd been no increase in off-site radiation levels at the 3 sites. So no radiation leaking out of any of them as far as they know. Now, of course, my rationale, like I've said, is not going to be the same as Donald Trump's rationale. And, you know, I can justify or not, as it turns out, the strikes on Iran. And, you know, Trump could do what I justify, but have a completely different reason for it. So doing the right thing for the wrong reasons, or doing the wrong thing for the wrong reasons, depending on where I sit. So Rolling Stone here, for example, has a piece now. There's no intel. Trump's attacks on Iran were based on vibes, sources say. So Trump's attack on Iran were based on vibes, not new intel. 2 administration officials tell Rolling Stone. There is no intel, one of the sources says. Quote, the intelligence assessments have not really changed. Now, if that's true, then that's a bit of a problem, because you have Trump. Like, okay, I might agree with what he ended up doing, but my goodness, if you're doing it because of vibes and not the kind of, I'm racking my brain as to whether this thing is justifiable or not, and, you know, spending hours and hours deliberating on this and trying to, he's like, hey, look good on TV, so that's why I did it. I just want to get some of the glory. Like, if that's what he's doing, then what? Holy crap, this man's a dangerous man. This man is a dangerous man. So here we have the New York Times. So amazing, says Greg Sargent. New York Times has more confirmation that Trump's decision to bomb Iran was motivated in large part by the way the Israeli strikes were playing on Fox News, which drove him to want some credit for it. Holy cow. So Mr. Trump has spent the early months of his administration warning Netanyahu against a strike on Iran. But by the morning of Friday, hours after the first Israeli attacks, Trump had changed his tune. He marveled to advisors about what he said was a brilliant Israeli military operation, which involved a series of precision strikes that killed key figures in Iran's military leadership and blasted away strategic weapons sites. Mr. Trump took calls on his cell phone from reporters and began hailing the operation as, quote, excellent and, quote, very successful, and hinting that he had much more to do with it than people realised. Later that day, Mr. Trump asked an ally how the Israeli strikes were playing. He said that everyone was telling him he needed to get more involved. So Trump isn't this kind of Gandhi-esque advocator of peace, right? He's not the peace president. He's using that as a political tool to gain votes, right? But he's just as likely as Bush to do something bellicose if it clothes him in glory. That is Trump all over. So the New York Times then continues by saying, okay, we'll go to the next page. Political advisors to Mr. Trump have been swapping notes on various public and private polls, examining the popularity of military action against Iran, noting that American support for an operation depended in part on how pollsters asked the question. While polls showed that an overwhelming majority of Americans did not want the United States to go to war with Iran, most Americans did not want Iran to obtain a nuclear weapon. The president was closely monitoring Fox News, which was airing wall-to-wall praise. And I talked to you about this the other day, how Fox News is very kind of neocon pro-Israel, which was airing wall-to-wall praise of Israel's military operation and featuring guests urging Mr. Trump to get more involved. And we know that Trump watches Fox News and reacts to it. And this is his intelligence briefing is Fox News. It's not his freaking intelligence community. Several Trump advisors lamented the fact that Mr. Carlson was no longer on Fox, which meant that Mr. Trump was not hearing much of the other side of the debate. Wow. And then we have Pete Hegseth here. So let's go to the Secretary of Defense.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, concerning the justification for these strikes, in March, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released their threat assessment, concluding, quote, Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and Khamenei has not authorized the nuclear programs he suspended in 2003, unquote. So what new intelligence does the U.S. have since then that the Iranians have changed their position on nuclear weapons? And does this new intelligence come from U.S. sources and methods, or are we getting this information from other countries?
Okay, good question there. So what is Hegseth going to say about the intelligence concerning these facilities and the threat that Iran poses? And how does that feature in his calculations? So what does the intelligence community for the United States believe?
Well, I would just simply say that the president's made it very clear. He's looked at all of this, all of the intelligence, all of the information, and come to the conclusion that the Iranian nuclear program is a threat, and was willing.
Wow. His answer translates to this. So what the question was, what intelligence is there available to see if there's been any change since March when the DNI, Tulsi Gabbard, said X, Y, and Z? What intelligence is there? The answer is Trump's looked at everything and he's made a decision. No, we want to know what other intelligence. Trump's looked at it all and he's made a decision. And I trust Trump because if I don't trust him, I don't have a job. I am totally loyal to Trumpy Trumpster. And whatever he says goes. And even though the man doesn't read, he's read all the intelligence. He's seen all there is to see. And he's made an awesome decision. And don't listen to the Rolling Stone talking about his vibes. And don't listen to the New York Times talking about how he just looked at Fox News and thought, hey, that's a good idea. I can do that. I want to be a part of that. Yeah, it's not that. He's read and seen all of the intelligence that you can possibly imagine. That's how knowledgeable Trumpster is. I mean, the president is. Yeah.
To take this precision operation to neutralize that threat in order to advance American national interests, reduce the Iranian nuclear program, and obviously collective self-defense of ourselves and our allies. So he looked at all of it, understood the nature of the threat, and took bold action I think the American people would expect in a commander-in-chief. That's all we've got. Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, and that's that. That's all we got. Difficult question. I didn't answer it, and I'm walking away. So then we have this with Marco Rubio.
For the Americans at home who are going, are we at war? You know, I'm trying to suss out some of the facts here. So why would Iran agree to any peace deal if the United States has already pulled out of one that they had, as President Trump did in 2018, and now has launched 2 surprise attacks? Both Israel and the United States have done so. There is such a massive trust deficit there. How could you possibly come to
the trust deficit started with Iran.
I know.
Well, the trust deficit, the ones that shouldn't be trusted are the Iranians because they're the ones that sponsor terrorism. Did they forewarn us before they blew up the embassy in Lebanon and killed over 200 American servicemen? Did they forewarn us before they built IEDs and blew the legs and arms off?
It's really important you understand what Marco Rubio is doing here. So Marco Rubio is doing the old, they broke the rules so we can break the rules. And I've seen people say this on my threads, and that was kind of that wasn't quite my reasoning. My reasoning is that it justifies fudging the rules if it is indeed fudging the rules, and we're not clear it is, because the goal is so freaking important. Now my change is that actually some of the ramifications are more important really than I was giving them credit for being. He's saying they broke the rules so we can break the rules, and that's that. You know, why should you be trusted? Yeah, but they can't be trusted, which is the Tu-Quoc-Quay fallacy. So the Tu-Quoc-Quay fallacy, or the U2 fallacy, is if I go to you and say, hey, you committed a murder, that's absolutely terrible. You know, I'm morally evaluating what you have done as being really, really bad. And then you look back at me knowing that I've murdered someone and say, yeah, but you've murdered someone as well, JP. So now, while that may be correct, and while I may be a hypocrite in saying that murdering someone's really bad, I may be being a complete hypocrite. But looking back at me to say, well, you too, does not excuse the moral evaluation there. I might as well not exist, right? And the moral evaluation of you murdering someone is going to be, you know, one assumes bad, right? So just because I've done it too doesn't therefore justify you doing it. I should still, from a kind of moral evaluation point of view, be able to say what you did is bad, even though I've done it too, and that makes me bad as well. We're both bad. But me saying to you, that's bad, you looking back at me saying, yeah, but you too. And this is kind of whataboutism, but it's a very directed form of whataboutism to get you away from, to excuse your own moral shortcomings here. And that's what he's doing here.
Of American servicemen in Iraq. I mean, these are the people that are doing this forever. They're the ones that no one should trust. They're the ones that have lied about their nuclear program.
But
they're the ones that have hidden things from the international organisms.
But that sounds like we're headed towards regime change, or the desire to get these people out of power.
No.
Are you?
No. A serious foreign policy is one that's focused on identifying what our national interest is.
And remember, he said, no, it's not regime change. And then Trump's come out and pretty much indicated that, you know, we look at Trump, you know, saying, giving an indication that, you know, it's not politically correct to use the term regime change, but if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why wouldn't there be a regime change? Mega make Iran great again. So then, you know, you can say what you like, Marco Rubio, but it's going against what Trump is saying.
You don't have to like the regime. There are a lot of regimes around the world that we don't like, okay? But in this particular case, what we are focused on is not the changing of the regime. Okay, that's up to the Iranian people if they want to do that, but that's not what we're focused on. Our national interest is about one thing, and that is Iran not getting anywhere near the capability to weaponize and have nuclear weapons. They're not going to get anywhere near that capability. The president has made that clear from day one. Our preference for solving that problem, that very specific problem, is through diplomacy. We've said that. We've given it every opportunity. They played games. They tried delay tactics. They're trying delay tactics now on the Europeans because of the snapback provisions.
When did
and you
the
talk about the JCPOA, that was a crazy deal.
And it remains to be seen whether that was a crazy deal. You know, some Republicans think it was, but now Representative Jason Crow, who is, I think, a veteran as well, said Trump could only strike Iran if there was imminent risk to U.S. facilities or personnel. Absent this self-defense authority, he needs congressional approval for military action. So this is where it gets to legal arguments concerning U.S. constitutionality. And, you know, you can make a unilateral decision, as far as I understand it, if there's an imminent threat. So this is where the imminence is important. When I was saying imminence is not important, I was talking about just nip it in the bud, you know, blow up the nuclear facilities if you can. Now, from just a kind of general position, but from within the US and from within the structure of the judiciary, you know, well, how the Constitution pertains to decision making, this is an issue, right? So if it's not imminent, then he can't make that unilateral decision. And all the intelligence community personnel appear to be saying it wasn't imminent. So therefore, he's got a bit of a problem because, you know, it doesn't really work so well, as Pete Hegseth saying at the podium, then he's looked at all of the intelligence and he's made a decision. Awesome stuff, because actually that's not going to fly in a court of law. So Trump really needs to think long and hard about this imminence issue with regard to the fact that Congress were not sought for approval. So absent this self-defense authority, needs congressional approval for military action. As a member of the House Intelligence Committee, I've seen no intel showing an imminent risk. And there are other people that said similarly, like Chris Murphy here says, I was briefed on the intelligence last week. Iran posed no imminent threat of attack to the United States. Iran was close to building a deliverable was not close to building a deliverable nuclear weapon. The negotiations Israel scuttled with their strikes held the potential for success. Now, again, that is a US constitutional issue, as opposed to, you know, from someone like me, my rationale as to whether it's justifiable because of, you know, taking out those nukes and fudging a little bit over here or whatever. However, I was seeing that. Adam Kinzinger is not a fan of this. He says, let's sigh. My concern, Democrats will go crazy about this as they did with Soleimani strike, and they will be as wrong as they were with the Soleimani strike. I don't know. I think there is a bit of a legal issue there that needs to be sorted out. Now, Tom Tugendhat, who's a Conservative politician from the UK who ran for leader of the Conservative Party, is more supportive of these strikes, at least from a UK kind of point of view.
Used to. I must just pick up, if I may, on some of the points that the ambassador made that were, frankly, staggeringly dishonest, total lies. The idea that these...
And Tom Tugendhat comes from a military background as well.
...negotiations were ongoing and that in some way others have violated it is a complete lie. The Iranians themselves, when the Board of Governors reported the IAEA in May, saying that, as you rightly said, they were in breach of the agreements, the Iranian government said, well, in that case, we're going to increase enrichment from a third secret site we never told you about over the last 20 years. Right? So they've admitted themselves that they have lied to the IAEA over many years. And what they have done is they have spent 40 years developing weapons for the specific purpose of killing Jews. They then breached sanctions, and when they've been given a break, as they were under the JCPOA, where did that money go to? Did it go to hospitals and schools? No. It went to murdering Syrians. It went to murdering maybe 1 million Sunni Muslims in Syria, in Lebanon, and so on. And you know what's really striking? Listen to the silence in the Middle East. Total silence. No protest at all from the Syrian government, from the Lebanese government, from the Iraqi government, from the Saudi government, and from many, many other governments.
So you're suggesting that other countries in the region are happy to see this happen?
They're not only in the region, Iranians in Iran have been speaking privately to me and to others about how they are supportive of attacks on the IRGC and on the missile facilities. Absolutely. I don't mean on the civilian, you've got to be very careful about this. But the IRGC has spent 40 years murdering Iranians through its Basij militia, which sadly is supported by people like those who organised the Christmas.
And we said this.
So that's the other side of the coin there, and I think he makes some perfectly valid points there, to be perfectly honest. So Donald Trump has been, sounding off about this and being very bombastic, but I don't know that he's being particularly careful with his thinking. Here, people are pointing out that he can't even spell his own name. Donald J. Trump. Donald J. Trump, President of the United States, has an update. The great B-2 pilots have just landed safely in Missouri. Thank you for your job well done, Donald J. Trump. The reason I bring this up is not because he can't spell his own name, but just the President of the United States, all caps. Like, this is all about him. I think, just remember, I always say concentrate on little things that give you a window into larger intentions and people. So the psychology of Trump is like, I'm going to end my Truth Social foreign diplomacy with my name in capitals and my position in capitals, because this is me. I am President of the United States, and this is all about me. And you feed that back into vibes and looking at the Israelis and saying, hey, they're doing really successful strikes on Iran. I want a piece of that, which is what the New York Times article suggests. And I utterly would believe that. I'd utterly believe that he would watch Fox News and go, oh, I want to be successful. I want to be this kind of history-changing world leader. Let me have a piece of that. Yep, I reckon we can send in the B-2 bombers and blah. It doesn't matter about the legality of it. Yeah, let's just do it. I don't even need to. You can say that I've read all the intelligence, but hey. And meanwhile, as Mehdi Hassan says here, wow, Prime Ministers of Canada and the UK posting almost identical statements like they're members of the US Congress who just got a call from their donors. As you heard from Rory Stewart, there's been this rather mute response from everyone, and that is largely going to be because they know that it's legally dodgy. They might agree that it's quite useful to take out the nuclear sites, like I think it is. But if they go publicly against the United States, then you're going to have further division amongst these really important alliances. And at the moment, it's already pretty fractured concerning Ukraine. And I just don't think anyone has the appetite to just completely stand up to the United States, other than Secretary General of the United Nations, Guterres, who's the only one that seems to have come out and been more forthright. And I think this just shows that, again, and this is Rory Stewart's issue here, is that it looks like the United States could just make whatever decision is right. They can say whatever they want, do whatever they want, and no one's willing to stand up to it. And then that sets a precedent for other large nations to do likewise, or even smaller nations with other nations saying, hey, I'm taking your island because you are an existential threat to us. And, I don't really have to prove that. And I don't really have to prove the imminence of that because, do you know what? The US did this previously, and therefore there's my legal precedent. Talking about why he's doing this, vibes and sense of celebrity. In fact, it's interesting that prior to that excerpt of Alistair Campbell, Rory Stewart, they were talking about how he's just treating his presidency like a reality TV show. And I think there is that element, but also thrown in is that Stephen Miller, who is Jewish, but one of these like crazy right-wing Jews like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, and who is running the show in the White House. I think Republicans are acknowledging that Trump is controlled by Stephen Miller. So this is Chuck Grassley, who is an old school, I say old school because he's about 154. Chuck Grassley here is saying, as a senator, if you want to get to President Trump, go through Stephen Miller. Just read the front page article in the Wall Street Journal to see how powerful he is. So just read. Just absolutely incredible there. Good old homonyms. Really powerful. Stephen Miller is that powerful that Chuck Grassley is open to saying this in public. And then I'm going to do a bit of a corrective here to a claim from Scott Presler, who is a disreputable human being, if ever there was one, who says Democrat President Obama sent $1.7 billion in cash to Iran in 2016. The first payment was $400 million in cash. So this would be part of the JCPOA, right? If you do this with nuclear facilities and uranium, then you will get a load of money for it. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. And this worked, right? So followed by a secondary cash payment of $1.3 billion as a result of interest. Yes, our government gave $1.3 billion in cash to Iran because of interest. Fact. And of course, as you can guess, it's not a fact. So, as this source says, MAGA creeps like Scott Presler keep crying that Obama gave Iran billions. No, dumbasses. He gave them their own money back. The $1.7 billion came from $400 million Iran paid to the US in the 1970s for weapons that we never delivered after the revolution. We held their cash for 40 years and made interest off it. Obama settled the legal case in international court, gave them back what we legally owed plus interest, not taxpayer money and not a bribe. In return, Iran froze its nuclear program under the JCPOA. Then Trump, in his racist obsession with undoing anything Obama did, pulled out of the deal, slapped on sanctions and pushed Iran straight towards nukes. All because a wannabe dictator with the IQ of a well-done steak had a vendetta against a black president. Obama made peace through leverage. Trump is making war through hate. Okay, so you might not agree with those rhetorical flourishes or those just outright claims. But yeah, that is, I think, a much better understanding of where that money has actually come from. Right, I was going to have a whole section on Thomas Massie, but I'll leave that for another video because it has been far too long, really. But I just wanted to express that my evaluation has somewhat changed. Not that any of the facts on the ground have changed, just I've sat down and cogitated a little bit more, and not actually really because anyone in the threads or anything has convinced me particularly. I just, really, if anyone, it's going to be sort of Rory Stewart just talking about. I just had this sense that if we're going back to a time period where none of these institutions and legal mechanisms in the world mean anything, then that's exceptionally dangerous. So as weak as the UN is, well, we need to then make it stronger. Because if you just issue the rule of law, because it's convenient to do so, and actually, and I think there is a good reason to do that. So I still think there is a good enough reason to issue the rule of law in an isolated, if this case was isolated. if there are no ramifications to this in terms of international behaviour going forward, then I would be back at 55%. But actually, people are going to look at this and they are going to give themselves permission to do really bad things going forward, or there's a much greater probability that that might happen. So I need to be honest with myself and think, yeah, I slightly changed my mind. I'm not massively not in support of it, but that may change. But I'm probably, what did I say, 47%, 45%, something like that. And that may change again, and I may swing back the other way, or may go even further to, yeah, I don't think this is a good idea. But none of that's to do with the outcome, because we're still yet to see the outcome. And actually, if the outcome is that they really haven't damaged their capabilities, the Iranian capabilities, too much, then of course that makes the it makes it even more difficult to justify the strikes. But what we're doing in justifying them beforehand is we're trying to make predictions, and then when you get the data in, of course that can change the evaluation post facto. So yeah. Anyway, I felt I had to speak to you about this. I know I've done an awful lot on Iran, but this is Geopolitics channel. I know some of you are like, get back to talking about Ukraine, and some of you are saying, because I disagree with you, you shouldn't be talking about Iran and these strikes. And I simply won't do that. I'll talk about whatever I want to talk about. And if you don't want to watch it, honestly, you don't have to watch it. Like, I'm not forcing you to watch this, but this is super important, because actually it is also connected to Ukraine in terms of the rationale that Russia were using to invade Ukraine as kind of preemptive strikes and blah blah blah. So yeah, this is of course A, really important, and B, relevant to Ukraine anyway. That's enough from me. Too much talking. Take care. I really appreciate your support. Toodle pips.